Hi, my name is Phillip Ayoub. I'm really excited to get to present a new paper with my co-author, Kristina Stoeckl, who I'll introduce to you here. Kristina is a professor of sociology in the Department of Political Science at Luis, and together we wrote this paper called The Double-helix entanglements of transnational advocacy, moral conservative resistance to LGBTI rights. And what we're trying to look at here is basically the tension between two transnational advocacy groups in world politics. And it's part of, this paper is part of a larger project, and here we're trying to basically parse out an element of it around this concept around the double helix metaphor, which we try to offer using this example of LGBTI movements and their counter movement. And what we're proposing or arguing is that these resistances around LGBTI rights and their opposition help us think about rival movements in an interesting way, and that both the LGBTI movement and the resistances to them have employed some of the same transnational tools, and actually the opposition has increasingly copied or used some of those tools that garnered LGBTIQ people their widespread recognition in recent decades. And in the last decade or so, the opposition has been using that. And of course, there's been resistance to LGBTIQ mobilization always in history when those mobilizations have occurred. But in the last decade, we see much more of it kind of happening also at the global, organized global transnational level. And we argue that the opposition also uses, tactics that would conform to how we've thought about the boomerang and spiral models and human rights diffusion, but in a process that we would conceive of as a double helix. And what we want to point out with the double helix is that there is some depth to it. It's actually a double spiral where we see two movements that clash with each other to a certain degree at all different levels, local, national, and transnational. And we also show that these resistances are plural. They build up a long history of moral conservative narratives and ideas, and also an institutional infrastructure that goes back to the culture wars in the US and that have been globalized in really interesting ways. And they unite ideologically incongruent and geographically scattered actors around perceived threats such as communism or demographic decline or native Hispanic or secularism, but they always are laced with kind of a concern around gender and sexuality, which is part of our argument in this paper as well. And there's an important puzzle being addressed in that we had in the literature we had often thought of that nationalism and also the distinctiveness of face might impede this kind of cross-border organizing to some degree, or at least it wouldn't be as plentiful as we would expect with human rights groups. And that might still be true, that it's not as plentiful, but there's plenty of organizing nonetheless, and that's a little bit what the paper tries to put forward. As I mentioned already with the model, we're following here a lot of colleagues who have pointed out in their important work in the last 7 or 8 years that wonderful work that's shown that there are these rival advocacy networks around LGBTI rights and their opposition. And what Kristina and I are trying to add in this paper is that that changes also theoretically how we think about the boomerang and spiral model. And while we're not using this double helix metaphor in a biological sense, we liked the metaphor because it adds a bit of depth. It could be a double spiral model, but that wouldn't have this kind of plane of interaction between the two movements. And what we want to propose is that what this suggests is that rival TANs have a reciprocal relationship, whether they want to or not, and that they have to navigate each other's presence in an interactive space at all of these different levels. It's not just one movement entering a domestic space and meeting its opposition there. Instead, they organize at the whole series of level from international to national to local. And in other words, both those who seek the advancement of LGBT rights and those who oppose them use related strategies and instruments for mutually exclusive ends. Another part of the paper looks at the actors who compose this movement. And here we use both our interviews and presence at these World Congress of Families events, but also use the programs to really chart in a network analysis, who takes part. And we show that a lot of these groups, like the International Organization for the Family or Citizen Go, which is a right-wing digital platform, or Agenda Europe or the Global Homeschooling Network, is really focused on issues of LGBTI rights quite a bit. And they also have supportive states who champion, we could think of them as like norm entrepreneur states that champion certain issues like traditional values and have provided support to these movements. And they also use certain IOs that we think of as spaces traditionally for human rights advocates, even the United Nations and the European Union, to push some of these moral conservative policies. And you can see more of these maps in the paper, and they're probably very illegible here, but we just want to show with these images that there is quite a globally spanning reach of these movements. These are, the image on the right is the global network of the World Congress of Families organizing, for example, and it shows hosting and sending countries. And it really brings together all sorts of actors. Most of these actors can unite around an issue that other scholars have pointed out as well, that is around gender, so-called gender ideology, and this is a concept that unites many of these actors. It views gender as a set of unwanted ethical and social reforms around sexual and reproductive rights, around same-sex marriage and adoption, around new reproductive technologies, sex education, gender mainstreaming, protection against gender violence, of course, transgender and intersex rights, to oppose, that unites them together, that they work to oppose. And that can work as a kind of master frame that takes different forms in many different contexts, but is nonetheless using similar tropes there. And you can see that, for example, in this Citizen Go campaign around a petition to stop, quote unquote, indoctrination around LGBT rights by the toy maker Lego. And so you see it in German here, but it's used, this petition is then rewritten in many, many different countries to galvanize a certain base. And there's also been other kind of efforts to create, a counterpart to the rainbow flag by having a so-called natural families flag, which is depicted here. So there's all of these efforts that these groups use. And of course, that means that LGBTI activists or SOGI activists around sexual orientation, gender identity, have to respond to these frames in really interesting ways, and especially in deeply polarized times. There's a lot of engagement with this opposition. LGBTI rights movements have been, really working on how to develop new framing and also trying to defang some of the claims of this moral conservative resistance in order to reclaim and to push back against the idea that they are a foreign import and or that they are somehow a threat to the family or tradition or children. And so paradoxically, a lot of these strategies have led also to more rooted, more national, more family-focused, and even more religious frames among LGBT activists. And we include a lot of those examples in the paper as well. And the scope conditions of this project, just to end the abstract on that, we write particularly about the LGBTI movement's focus among these moral conservative actors. Of course, they are interested in gender holistically, which also centrally targets women's rights. For the focus of our project, we really emphasize, their attention to the LGBT rights movement, but of course it's in a broader, it sits in a broader network of issues around gender. Next, in terms of our method, we use a mixed method approach, drawing on our interviews. Our team did about 120 interviews with more conservative actors and about the same with LGBTI actors over the last decade plus of work, much of it happening in the 7-year stretch between 2016 and 2023 that was funded by the European Research Council grant on this topic. But we hope you enjoy the paper, and thank you so much for your attention.